Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again for Rabbi Silber's shir on Sefer Shemot. As per usual, I am inviting everyone to be a panelist. That just means that um, you'll be able to unmute and ask questions when we pause for them. And we can see your face if you choose to do that, which is always nice. In between pausing for questions, you can put your questions in the chat here or in Facebook Live, and I'll make sure that they get to Rabbi Silber. Um, and with that, I will turn it over.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're towards the very end of the third chapter, in the middle of God's conversation with Moshe. Conversation, that is to say that one might say negotiation. Moshe has been told that he is wanted to represent the interests of Israel to Paro, and not only that, but to take them out of Egypt and to bring them to the land that God has promised to give to the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. That's the charge that Moshe is given. We took note of the fact that from the very beginning, from the very first pasuk, Moshe had said Hineni, and if Hineni, in other contexts, twice in Sefer, three times in Sefer Reshit, means I'm going to do your bidding. Even before I know what you want, I'm going to do your bidding. So in a certain sense, one could say he's already agreed. Having said that, he certainly puts up a great amount of resistance, and he has all kinds of reasons why he's not the right person to go. So I just wanted to pick up towards the end of the third chapter, because there's some very interesting things over here that will come up later in the story. What's interesting here in chapter 3, beginning, let's say, with I would say even with the 16th pasuk number 16, he's told to gather the elders, Lech v'yosafta et ziknei Yisrael, and he's told to say to them, V'yamarta lehem, Adonai Elohei avotechem nirah elai, Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak lemor, Pokol pokadi etchem, Pietro asui lachem b'Mitzrayim. So God says to Moshe to gather the elders and tell them that God has appeared to me, the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. God has remembered, recalled. The word pokad has multiple meanings. Taken note of, they have over here that you, taken note of you, and that which was done to you in Egypt. And Vomar, I have said, I will bring you up out of the suffering of Egypt to the land of the Canaani and the Chiti, Amori, Prizi, Chivi, Rusi, to the land of the Canaanites, generically we call them the Canaanites, and where it's the Vachol Vash. So that's what Moses is being told that he should say to these elders, the Ziknei Israel. And then God continues. Vishamulu Kolecha, they will, Shamulu Kolecha can mean they will, literally they'll hear your voice, but it often means they'll accept what you say. Lishmoa in biblical Hebrew has multiple meanings. It can be to hear, it can be to understand, it can be it can be to accept. So B'Shamulu Kolecha means they're going to hear you. Presumably, your words will fall on people who are willing to hear and understand what you're saying. And then Uvata Atav is Israel that you, the others, will go to Melech Mitzrayim. And now God tells Moshe what to say. Even this is what you should say. Adonai Hayavot Ivriim Nikra Aleinu V'Yatah Neu Chana Derech Shloshim Yemim B'Midbar V'Nizbecha Adonai Eloheinu. That's what you're going to say. The God of our God, the God of the Hebrews, the Ivriim Nikra Aleinu. Kara usually means something happens, often by chance. It's a mikra, not something planned out. So when you go to Paro, tell them that we Hebrews, Ivrim, That's how the Egyptians might talk about Hebrews. Abram is the other side, the people from the other side. So the God of the Hebrews has chanced upon us, and therefore let us go 3 days in the desert to bring Nizbachar Hashem, to bring sacrifices to God. Now God continues. So Moshe is being prepared. Vani Adati, says God to him, I know. I know, says God, don't be disappointed. And when you go and speak to Paro, he's not going to pay attention. He's not going to listen to you. V'lo biyad chazakah can mean any number of things. It can mean even if I go against him with a strong hand, he still won't do it. He still won't allow it. It could mean, or not until he's hit with a strong hand, at which point he would allow it. It's very unclear from the text which of these two possibilities it is. But God says it won't. It sounds like it's not going to happen b'yad chazakah. It certainly won't happen right away. But v'shalachti et yadi v'iketi et Mitzrayim b'chol niflotai asher aseh, with all my wonders, not just a couple, but all of them. And then v'achrei chen yishalach etchem. Then he'll send you out. Only if I can bring about many, many wonders, plagues, then it will permit you to leave. Okay. Now God continues, and we'll go over this again, and we'll discuss this. The grace or of the people will be seen by the Egyptians. In other words, the Egyptians will favor these people. They're going to favor these Ivrim, these Hebrews. And therefore, when you leave, you won't leave empty-handed. We'll discuss about that in a few minutes. A woman will show literally to borrow, perhaps be given for a neighbor and those who dwell in a house, gifts. Clay kesef, clay zahavu, svalot, gifts of metal implements, wooden implements, or even dresses, clothing. You will place them upon your sons and daughters. You will despoil Egypt. You will despoil Egypt. This is the game plan. So actually, God lays the whole thing out, including the fact that the beginning will be very difficult because he's not going to pay attention. Not even if you do a lot of damage. He'll be far away. He'll be in exile someplace or other, and he won't pay attention. But Moshe is given a clear game plan, and Moshe has been told that despite the initial failure, don't worry about that. In the beginning, it's not going to be so simple, but ultimately, you will prevail. So this is God's speech to Moshe, after which we expect Moshe to say, okay, I already said Hineni, so I'll go, fine. That's not to happen. But before that, I just want to go back on some of these psukim and say a few words about these psukim. And then if anybody has comments or questions, be happy to hear it. So the first thing what's interesting is that in the very first verse, back in verse number 16, and we took note of this, and the commentaries take note of this, that Moshe speaks to the elders. So apparently the people have some kind of leadership. It's not very effective, but the people do have some kind of leadership. And Moshe is to go to them and tell them that the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov has appeared to me and has said, God has sorely remembered you and all that has happened to you in the land of Egypt. Now, that language of Pokod Pokad, we took note of a couple of weeks ago, that's what Yosef tells his brothers in the last speech in the book of Bereshit. Yosef says to his brothers, Pokod Yifkod Elohim Etchem. God will someday redeem you, using the word Pokod Yifkod. And here, God instructs Moshe to go to the elders and to say to them, Pokod Pokadati. So the Midrash, and Rashi is the voice of the Midrash, makes the connection between those two stories. And that is to say that Moshe has some kind of secret knowledge, something along those lines, which will validate him to these elders. Because what do they know from Moshe? He's an Egyptian who ran away to Midian. They don't know from him. So therefore, the God's instructing Moshe that go to the elders and say these words, Pokot Pokalati, and they'll hear those words, and they'll remember, because they're elders, they're old, they'll remember this tradition, and therefore someone will come out to assist the Jews. That's the first thing Rashi says, Pokot Pokalati. Now, I wanted to re-emphasize what we had mentioned in the past. And when you look at these verses, what God's plan is for the people, it doesn't seem to be a great spiritual awakening over here. The project seems to be fundamentally to take them out of slavery and to give them a sense of freedom. The word mitzvah, in other words, the elders are commanded by Moshe to do something. It's not to say that the children can't necessarily do something themselves. That's certainly a possibility. So we'll see how this plays out in the story. So this is, I emphasize that basically at this point, the focus is on giving them freedom, giving them space, a land of milk and honey. It's not presented as a great spiritual awakening in any form, but this is one of the reasons, and an important one, for being allowed to go to the land. The land is a place which takes in refugees, basically, what it comes down to. And this is not to be underestimated. This is one of the great significances of the land. Later on, we have a completely different description of the land. But at this point, this is what Moshe is told. So fine, you go down, they're going to listen to you. You're going to say to them, you're going to tell them that I plan to bring them up from the suffering of Mitzrayim. And V'shamulu kalecha, in the next verse, and they in fact will. Shamulu kalecha means they will hear you, but it means more than hear you, they will accept. L'shemoa in biblical Hebrew can mean many things. One of them is to accept. They'll accept what you're saying. They'll accept it. And they will go with you. You will go with the elders to the king of Egypt, and you will talk to the king of Egypt. And here Moshe is given a script, and we'll see later he doesn't seem to follow the script for whatever reason, but this is the script that he's given. This is a very important point, not just for this pasuk, but in general. This is a critical point. What Moshe says to Paro is, God has appeared to us, Nikra Aleinu, that's written with a hey, like chanced upon us. The God of Israel, the God of our ancestors, the God of the Hebrews, has chanced upon us. Let us go, please, a 3-day journey into the desert, and we will sacrifice to our God. Now, this is actually a very important point, because what it sounds like, why is this necessary, actually? This is the question. Why is it important to be permitted to go to the desert and to bring sacrifices to God, and a 3-day journey, no less? Why is this important? And it would, why not just say, let us go, or else there'll be plagues or whatever? But it does appear in the storyline that they can't actually leave until they bring these sacrifices. And the reason for that, I think, is actually quite simple. That it's through the service of God, serving God, so avoda, that they become one people. That is to say, the bringing of the sacrifices clarifies what in this book it means to be a people. What it means to be a people in the book of Shemot is people who serve one God. So the community is formed around the centrality of God within the community, as it says, and service to that God unites the people. So that's how you form community. Community is formed through service of God. This is a critical point in the book of Exodus, and it comes up later, of course, in terms of the Mishkan. The book of Exodus ends. 4 of the last 5 parshiot are either instructions about how to build the Mishkan, or a description of the building of the Mishkan. So we have to take very seriously the idea that the goal of leaving Egypt, or one of the goals, is to build a Mishkan. It certainly sounds that way when you read the whole book of Shemot, the 40 chapters of Shemot, because there are about, I don't know how many chapters are devoted from chapter 25 till the end of the book, which is chapter 40. I would say there are about 11 or 12 chapters which deal with the Mishkan. So obviously it's very important. And the Ramban is the one who said this is the goal of the book. The goal of the book is to have sacred spaces. That's the goal. So, but we have to get there. So this is, in other words, what I'm suggesting is it's a prerequisite. You can't leave Egypt until first you brought the sacrifice. And why must you go on a 3-day journey? You must go on a 3-day journey, not because you plan to run away. No, there's no intimation Moshe plans to run away. It could be that Paro thinks he might run away, but there's no suggestion that he plans to run away with the people, but rather, there's no point to leave Egypt unless you are a nation. What makes you a nation in this book is the common service of God. People join together to serve God. That defines them as a nation. That's the place of the Mishkan in the book. That's a very important point. Now, what eventually happens to this request? Because Paro does not actually ever permit them to go. I mean, we'll see that, but I wanted to make one point about these verses that I think is a very important point. I make a couple of comments, then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. And what I want to point out is, so first, God says to Moshe, Paro is not going to listen. Even with a strong hand, he's not going to listen. And therefore, V'sholachti et yodi v'iketi et Mitzrayim v'chol diflotai asher asem b'kirbo achrei chen yishalach etchem. He's only going to permit you to go if I bring about many wonders and miracles, etc. Afterwards, he'll let you go. And then the next verse is, I will place the grace or the favor of the people in the eyes of the Egyptians, and when they leave, they will not leave empty-handed, they'll be given gifts. So here I want to point out, it's not 100% clear from these two verses, but there is a theme that emerges later during the course of the 10 plagues. And that is, who actually is going to free the Jews from Egypt? So the one who's calling the shots is actually Paro. But the truth of the matter is that the actual enslaving of the Jews, it was initiated by Paro, but it sounds from chapter 1 that individual Egyptians were slave owners. And it's quite conceivable then, when you think about it, that when the Jewish people are given permission to leave Egypt, we have to see this later on, but it's quite conceivable, because the question is who actually lets them go. Is it Paro? Or is it the common people, or the officers of Paro? One can make a strong case that even at the very, very end, it's the Egyptian people who actually free the Jews, not Paro. Paro never really let them go, even if he permitted them to serve God, but they have to come back. That you can't leave. Whereas the Egyptian people, it might appear, actually are freeing the Jews. So that's a very important point that we'll come across this later on. But I want to make one last point before I stop and take comments or questions, which is this. Whatever happened to this request to go into the desert and to bring sacrifices and to rejoice? Whatever happened to that request? The idea was we want to go into the desert, a 3-day journey, and bring sacrifices. But it never happens. So what happened to that request? It was just a ruse, but never happens, or does it actually take place in the book of Exodus? So I did want to make one suggestion, which I made in the past. I think it's an important suggestion. The reason they have to go into the desert for 3 days is that for whatever reason, the Egyptian people will not tolerate them bringing the sacrifice inside Egypt. Whatever the reason is, some kind of a taboo, some kind of thought maybe the cow is sacred, Could be any number of things. But the fact of the matter is that you can't bring the sacrifice in Egypt. That's what impossible to bring a sacrifice in Egypt. But the fact of the matter is that actually later Israel does bring a sacrifice in Egypt. In the 12th chapter of this book, which begins by Deber Hashem, El Moshe Aharon B'Eretz Mitzrayim Le'emor, that God spoke to Moshe and Aaron in the land of Egypt. Chapter 12. And what is the subject of chapter 12? Well, the subject of chapter 12 is the Korban Pesach. So the Korban Pesach, if you think about it this way, the Korban Pesach is the fulfillment of Moshe's request to Paro that we be allowed to go into the desert for 3 days and bring sacrifices and to serve God through sacrifice. Okay, that never happens. But by the time that the 10th plague rolls around, yes, then the Israelites are permitted to bring a sacrifice, to bring this Korban Pesach. So the Korban Pesach then is simply the fulfillment of what Moshe has asked Paro from the very beginning. Not 10 animals, maybe 1 animal, 2 animals, or whatever, but this is the fulfillment of the request to go in a 3 days journey. So that's actually a very important point about the car. And the reason for it is simple. The reason is that the sacrifice, it's not just about sacrifice, it's the common service of God is what defines the people as a Jewish people. Prior to that, if you have 100 to 95, then it drops down maybe to 78% or whatever. So this is the thinking over here, and this is the preamble to the Korban Pesach. Now there's more to say. Let me just stop here for a second and take any comments or questions anybody may have.
Rabbi Silber,
yeah,
it's interesting the way they are instructed to phrase when they first go to Pharaoh. It doesn't say, we want to go. Just says, this God appeared to us. It's a very passive way of presenting.
Yes, it is. Right. It's put in terms of not even we want to do it, but this God has literally chanced upon us. So it's a way to, Pharaoh can't say, oh, you're just a bunch of, fakers or whatever it is. No, it's not even our initiative. But the God of the Hebrews has changed, and we'll see this later on, that the God of the Hebrews, that Moshe says later on, that we have to follow the God of the Hebrews, because if we don't follow, we're gonna have plagues against us. Lest this God plague us with sword or with pestilence. So that's part of it. You're right about the language over there.
Right.
Big later one. Chanced upon us. It's God's initiative, not ours. That's what Moshe says.
They omit the fact that they were Waitzaku. They actually prayed to be let go.
Yes, they don't mention that. Why should they? Right. They're putting in terms of this God, this powerful God, who, and we don't want to mess with this God. It's very powerful. That's exactly what they say. And notice, we'll come across this later, how God, what language God tells them to speak. Eloheo Ivriyim, not Yisrael. Because the difference between Ivri and Yisrael, the Yisrael is someone who has a certain identity, Jewish identity, Jacob figure, an Israel figure. But the other one, Eloheo Ivriyim, the Ivri is the one from the other side. That's not that necessarily you have your own identity. That's the identity that the other places upon you. So the other, the Ivri is the other. So this is so this is what God instructs Moshe. Now we'll see later on, he doesn't follow instructions, but this is the plan. Okay, that's the second point. Anybody else for a comment?
Yes, Rabbi?
Yeah.
I don't think Paro was ever told all throughout all the following chapters that Bnei Israel want to leave for good. It's always the 3 days to serve God. So isn't that really a ruse and to fool Paro? And then in the end, we go out, they say, Kumutsu b'tachami. But it's to me, it doesn't sound like that the Korban Pesach makes up for it. It just sounds like that this is the excuse that Moshe is saying again and again and again, and Paro was never told that the Jews really want to go free.
No, he's not told that. I agree. He's not told that. I'm not suggesting. No, let me just clarify what I'm suggesting. There's some people who think Now the whole thing is a big ruse. He said, go to a 3-day, you have a 3-day distance, and then with a 3-day distance, you get a head start, and you'll be able to escape. I'm not suggesting that. I don't think that's true. What I'm suggesting is something else, which is the idea of the Korban Pesach. Now, it just so happens, and we'll talk about this, that once they bring the Korban Pesach, they actually leave. But I don't think that was Moshe's intention with the 3-day journey. Moshe had something else in mind. Moshe, I think, had in mind, if we don't have our own community, in some sense of community, what's the point of leaving? We're not going to leave as a bunch of ragtag slaves. You want to leave with a kind of national identity. And the way you get a national identity in this book, the Sefer Shemot, is by we are a people that serve the same God. We worship and serve the same God. That's my point. So, unless you have an identity, you can't leave. It could be you go for a 3-day journey today, and in 8 months you leave. That's okay. But Moshe's point is that without this identity, not to power, but to us, without this identity, there's no point to leave. Because the point of the book is to become a nation. And what makes you a nation, what connects me to the other person, is that we have a common service, a common prayer, a common service. And that's the point I'm making about Moshe's request. And that's the Korban Pesach. If this so happens, once you bring the Korban Pesach, you're out of there. You're wearing your, you have your staff, and you have your shoes, right? You're all dressed to go. But that's, and the Korban Pesach, before the Korban Pesach, you can't leave. So what I'm saying is the Korban Pesach makes it possible to leave. But with the situation, the Korban Pesach, we're actually thrown out of Egypt. The Egyptian people kick us out. Which brings us back to the other question I raised about our relationship to Paro versus the relationship to the Egyptian people. So that's a separate question. We'll deal with that. Okay. Let me make one last point about the end of chapter 3. We started reading it last week, and this is this business of asking the women asking their neighbors to borrow. It sounds like to borrow. Well, some people think lahashil does not mean to borrow, so if to keep it as yours, silver and gold vessels and garments, you will place them on your sons and daughters. The nitzaltim at Mitzrayim, you will nitzaltim is to empty out. You will despoil or empty out Mitzrayim. That's what God says to Moshe. God is predicting, tell you Moshe what's going to happen. So here, there are a couple of questions. First of all, what is the nature of this money that's being given them? How do we understand the money that's being given them? Why are they entitled to take this money? Okay, is it taking? Is it borrowing? It sounds from the context like taking. Why is this legitimate? And before we suggest reasons why it might be legitimate, we have to go back to the covenant in chapter 15 of Breshit, the Brit Beit HaBetarim, where God said to Abraham that the nation that enslaves them I will punish, and they will leave with a lot of wealth. So it means that this is alluded to over here, that before you leave, speak to your next door neighbor. They will give you gold and silver and other kinds of items, and you will take it, and you will despoil Egypt. The Tzaltim at Mitzrayim, you will despoil Egypt. So this is predicted already back in Sefer Breshit, chapter 15 of the covenant. But what is the justification for it? So it's actually a very interesting question about the justification. And there are two main opinions. And it's not clear which is the better opinion. So one opinion is that this is essentially a kind of reparations. That is to say, it's payment for all the labor we did all those years as slaves and never got any kind of remuneration for it. So now that we're leaving, the enslavers are told to contribute to different Jews, a jar of whatever, and this is fair because you worked all these years for nothing. You were enslaved. So this
Rabbi
is payment
Silber,
for. Yes.
Nitzaltem is also to take advantage. That's a modern day.
Nitzul, yeah.
That's correct, right. That is very correct. And it's related, I think, it's related here to the Pshat, which is it doesn't mean to save Egypt. It means to It means to empty out Egypt.
Egypt.
I'll come back to that word, to empty out,
May,
to
may I
make
just,
empty.
yeah,
I'll show you that in a minute. It's very interesting. Yes.
can I just ask a question? Because Nitzul, Hatzalah is also Venitzaltem is a recurring theme of the Exodus, you know, like
Yes, it is.
very
Right.
and when I read this, I can't help but think this is what this is saying. I am saving you from Egypt, not because how much money, you know, because if they're just borrowing it and, you know, even if it's compensation, they're not, you know, it seems like the biggest holdup in history that's just being glossed over. And then, but it's really about saving, I don't know, or redemption.
Well, there's two things. First of all, if it's payment for all the years of enforced labor, one could make a strong argument they're entitled to that. That's number one.
Still, I agree, but still.
What actually bothers people more than that is the question of what does it mean to borrow it? In other words, to take it is one thing, but how do we understand the word in verse number, was it 22, Visha'Allah? Visha'Allah usually means to borrow something. Visha'Allah is to ask the question, may I borrow something? I mean, it could be that it's a gift over here. You know, that's possible. It's not clear what Visha'Allah means. It's a very good question, but that's the issue that bothers some people. And that is one possibility, that it's actually considered called reparations or payment for past services that were never paid for.
Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
it's as if Shaul was on borrowed time till David came along.
What do you mean by that?
As a king, I'm saying on a certain level. I mean, he had a lot of alot, but it was all still till the time that David would become. Just that the language, you know, Shaul a different way.
Right. I mean, he's called Shaul because he's the one that people requested. That's why he's called Shaul. The requested one is Shaul. I'm saying Sha'Allah Ishami, a Shoel in the Torah later in this book, in the codes, is one who is given something to use without paying for it. That's a Shoel. And you know, there's a whole discussion in the Gemara, the Mishnah Gemara, about what is the status of the Shoel vis-a-vis the object that he is entrusted with. He certainly is fully responsible for almost everything that might happen to it. You know, is it his? Is it not his? These are interesting questions in the Gemara. Anyway, one possibility for this business of taking money from Mitzrayim is payment for past services. That's one possibility. And then there's another possibility, which is also equally plausible and a very interesting possibility. And this is based on the psukim that we read about in Sefer Dvarim about the Eved Ivri. So there the Torah says in Sefer Dvarim that if you have a Hebrew slave, man or woman, they can only work for 6 years. They don't work for more than 6 years. And when you let them go, when you free the slave after 6 years, or under other conditions that you free them, you have to give them hanek tanikro. You have to give them gifts from your threshing floor, from your vineyard. You have to give them gifts. That's fair. So the idea of hanakah is a very interesting concept. The idea of hanakah is not payment for past services. That's not what it is. Hanakah is a gift that you give the slave who was freed. It's a payment of money. It's a kind of bonus, as it were, for the work done. But I presume it's also intended to give money to the slave who now wants to be incorporated into society. If you have no money, it's not simple to do that. So Hanakah is a very interesting concept. Hey, Ayin, Nun, Kufay comes up in Parshat Re'eh and Sefer Devarim. That's different. That's not payment for past services. That's a gift. And the idea of the gift makes a lot of sense because let's say you're in jail and you get out of jail and you've lost your business or whatever it is, and you leave jail and they give you a couple of dollars. So what are you going to do? You should have money for a couple of weeks, maybe for a month. But then you're going to have no sources of income and you may well end up right back in jail. So the idea of Hanakah is a gift by the master to the servant to try to ensure that the servant, at least hypothetically, won't end up back in slavery. That's the idea of Hanakah. So these are two possibilities that are two live possibilities concerning why the Israelites should be given, money or whatever when they leave Egypt. And this comes up in several different venues, but I mentioned the Pesukim and Sefer Dvarim. This is actually a very interesting question. Now, one last point. Let me just make a comment about somebody mentioned earlier the verb nitzal or lihilatseo, right? You have that word in. You have the word in Mari to take advantage of something. Hit natsut, to take advantage of a situation. It's not negative necessarily, but take advantage of time or situation. But the truth of the matter is, in yesterday's Torah reading, the word comes up. The word comes up in yesterday's Torah reading, and that's the story of the golden calf. Golden calf story is one of, if not the most significant story, I think, in the entire Torah, outside of maybe some stories in Sefer Bereshit. It's really a defining moment for the Jewish people. So in the story of the golden calf, you remember that after the people make a golden calf, worship the golden calf, and Moshe is absent. I think Moshe he's gone. Where is he? He's gone. They need some physical thing that will connect them to God. They worship the golden calf. Moshe's on the mountain. He's told about this. Prays for the people. Comes down the mountain and he smashes the tablets. He's carrying the tablets of God and he smashes the tablets. One of the most dramatic moments. And then begins the process of reconciliation. That's simple. Moshe is the broker who tries to bring the two sides together. If you look at chapter 33 of Sefer Shemot, just for a moment, look at chapter 33. So this is after it's a kind of civil war. The people that made the perpetrators of the golden calf, it's a civil war. Many are killed. 3,000 are killed. And God says to Moshe, take the people up to the land. You can take them up to the land. Chapter 33, verse number 1, I think it is. Verse number 1. Chapter 33, verse number 1. Moshe, take the people up from this place to the land that I swore to give to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's verse number 1. 33:1. And it says, and I will send my angel before you, and I will chase out the peoples of the land and bring them to a land of milk and honey. Can we get that on the screen? It's chapter 33, verses 1, 2, and 3. Scroll, just get to Sraya. It's the book of Exodus, chapter 33, beginning in verse number 1. I want to look at the first 4 or 5 psukim over there, 6 psukim. Right, this is what they write. So let's be more than fine. So God says, listen, you can get, it's all good. You're going to go into the land. I'll send my angel, my very best angel, drive out the inhabitants. You have the milk and honey. The only thing is, I'm not going to go with you. Have a good trip. I'm not going. And the reason I can't go with you, says God, there's a good reason I can't go. Because we're going to fight, and I'll destroy you. If we have another fight, you're going to make me angry. I will consume you. I will destroy you. So it's better I not go. I'm going to lose my temper. And, I send my angel, drive out the inhabitants, fine. Verse number 4. וישמע את הדבר הרע הזה ויתאבלו והושטו איש את יואליו. The people heard this bad news. ויתאבלו, they mourned, went into mourning. והושטו איש את יואליו, and they did not put on their jewelry. They didn't put on their jewelry. Right? So God responds in verse number 5. Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Amora b'nei Israel atamam sheol. Tell them, you're stubborn. Rega echad elabikir b'cha v'chiliticha. If I go amongst you even for a moment, I will destroy you. V'yatoho reid et yechabi alecha. Take off your jewelry, your ornaments. V'yedom ma'es selach, and I'll know what to do with you. So immediately in this verse number 5, we have a problem. What is the problem? Which is obvious. The problem is that verse number 4 said they did not put the jewelry on. So what does it mean in verse number 5 to say take off your jewelry? They don't have any jewelry. They didn't put the jewelry on in verse number 4. That's a problem that bothered the commentaries. So the Ibn Ezra answers. Ibn Ezra says that Loshatu Isha and Yoalav, they did put their jewelry on, for God had said. In other words, verse number 5 in a sense precedes verse number 4. They didn't put the jewelry on because God said keep the jewelry off, for God had said. The problem is that interpretation makes perfect sense, but it doesn't seem to say God had said. It says God said. So if we interpret the verses to be in chronological order, we would have to say something like, they didn't put the jewelry on that morning. They kept the jewelry off. Then God says to Moshe, take off the jewelry. That is, make sure the jewelry's off. Don't put it on. And we're going to figure this thing out. God says, I don't know what to do. God is sympathetic. Let me figure out what to do over here. On one hand, if I go amongst you, I'll destroy you. On the other hand, you're in mourning. People are in mourning. So we have Loshatu Isha and Yoalav in verse number 4. We have Horeid and Yechabi Alecha in verse number 5. And then you get to verse number 6, which is what? Vayitnatzlu b'nei Israel et Edyam mehar Horeid. Vayitnatzlu. So here the English translation we have is, so the Israelites, here they say, remain stripped of their finery from Mount Horeb on. And what would appear to be, Vayitnatzlu, of course, reminds us of the word we just read in chapter 3, V'nitzaltem et Mitzrayim, you will despoil Egypt. In other words, a way to read this is 3 consecutive verbs, each more powerful than the previous one. They didn't put the jewelry on. Keep it off. They stripped themselves totally of the jewelry. However, it reflects itself in the reality of it. There are 3 words, each one more powerful than the last. And the reason I mentioned all this, V'nitzaltem et Mitzrayim, because the Chumash is actually, in effect, raising a very interesting question. What happens to the gold and the silver that we take out of Egypt? What happens to that gold and silver that we take out of Egypt? Well, we know what happened to some of the gold and silver that we took out of Egypt, because we read it in yesterday's Torah reading. It's called the golden calf. So the gold and the silver they took out of Egypt, actually, some of it was used to make a golden calf. The golden calf, then, if you think of it this way, the golden calf means that you may have physically left Egypt, but spiritually you're still in Egypt. That's the idea of the golden calf. Eventually, what happens to the gold and the silver that they take out of Egypt, eventually it's used to build the Mishkan. That's how the book ends. So there's 2 different stages. One stage, they took the gold out of Egypt, and on the first stage, they built a golden calf. Then they divested themselves by Yitnatzlu. I'm not touching that gold. And then at a later stage, they find a way to reincorporate the gold to build the Mishkan, which is very interesting in terms of two different, I would say, approaches to repentance. One is to distance yourself from your past. That was my former life. I'm not going there anymore. And the other is try to figure out a way to reincorporate your past into your present life. I mention all this because of the Mitzrayim, the stuff they're given by the Egyptians, the gold and the silver and all that, can be seen in two radically different ways. One is it represents a connection to Mitzrayim, we're still connected. And the other is it represents our freedom, and it represents at a certain stage using your past or integrating your past into the present. And I think over the course of the book of Shemot, we have these two stages, which is interesting. The first is the distance, and the second is the Mishkan, to vow it here, to give the gold and the silver, etc. And actually, the holiest vessels of the tabernacle are made out of gold. Different gifts perform different functions, but the holiest pieces of the temple are actually made out of gold. So let me stop here for a minute before we continue with next chapter. And are there any comments or questions? Happy to take them.
Yes, Rabbi Silber.
Yes.
This task of collecting the gold and silver,
Yes.
it's sort of palmed off to the women. Why is that? I know that women have jewelry and so on, but it's still,
I assume that's
if you're
that.
going to empty out the coffers of people,
Right.
usually it's the men who collect the booty.
Well, yeah, true. That is very true. I assume it's what you said, basically, that if we're talking about, we're talking about, jewelry, basically. I presume that though men wear jewelry as well, but the women, we find more in the Bible that the jewelry is associated with the women. Interesting, by the way, is something else, that jewelry in the Torah is associated sometimes with idolatry, both in terms of the golden calf and also in terms of in Sefer Breshit, in chapter 35, after the story of Dinah, Yaakov says to the people to remove the foreign gods from your midst, and they gave to Jacob the golden jewelry. They gave to Jacob the jewelry, so it sounds like the jewelry is connected to idolatrous practice, which certainly is in the case of the golden calf. But it probably, as you say, it's probably because the jewelry is associated more with the women than the men. I don't think it means only women should do it, but the women are told to ask their neighbors, whatever, or those that they live with. It says that you will place it upon your sons and upon your daughters, and that mentions the daughters as well. So, and you will despoil Egypt. I wanted to add one other point before someone else makes a comment about the significance of taking this of getting these gifts. I think there's a very important significance over here that the Torah is getting at, which is that actually for the slaves, the idea that the Egyptians actually give them gifts, okay, is a sign of their freedom. In other words, the slave very often, sad to say, measures things by what the master thinks. So the idea that their former masters actually look favorably upon them and give them gifts is for the slaves a sign of their freedom. And that's what the Torah said back to Avram. God says to Avram, back in chapter 15 of Breshit, it doesn't mean in the covenantal formula in chapter 15 of Breshit, that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is not to get gold and silver. The ultimate goal is to receive the Torah, to enter the land. That's the fourth generation. But the fourth generation shall return to the land. But the third generation will leave Birchush Gadol. That's a very important point, because the third generation is still slaves, slave mentality. So as far as they are concerned, maybe the best we can do is some sign of freedom given to them by the former oppressors. Whereas the fourth generation shall return to the land. They don't need the approval of Mitzrayim. They can have a kind of internal approval based on their connection to God and their Torah that they're being taught. So they don't need Mitzrayim. But the slaves that leave Egypt still measure things by Mitzrayim. That's why getting the gold and the silver is very important. Okay, anybody else for a last comment on this? We'll come back to it, of course, but
real quick?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes,
Yeah, just leit natzel in Hebrew is to,
yes,
in modern Hebrew is to apologize or to be sorry. And,
that's
maybe
true. Right, to
in
regret.
this instance, there
Right,
also there's a measure of regret, of a teshuvah going
that's
on.
right. Well, it's a measure of regret. Right. How it comes, right? I need that sale means I'm sorry, right? I have to look and see the semantics of that. It does mean that, but the nitzaltem at Mitzrayim is usually taking to empty out. It's
Yes, but it's uninteresting the same root
yes, it's very interesting. I agree. It's
as
quite
all
interesting, right?
including redemption. So
Yes, right. So that's what Hatzil. That's true. But I'm saying over here, it may even be playing off Hatzil. You could even make that argument. In a certain kind of sense, I mean, this is a drasha I might give on Shabbos or something, that by allowing the Egyptians to pay you back, by accepting reparations, let's say, or by accepting gifts, you in a sense are allowing them to put some of this in the past. This was a whole dispute about taking reparations from Germany after the Holocaust. Exactly the question, because some people felt, I'm not going to take anything from them. I don't want to let them off the hook. You know what I mean? That's too easy. Pay some money, and
Blood money.
as if nothing happened. Blood money, exactly. So there was a whole debate. On the other hand, one could make the argument that from a practical standpoint, why? I mean, people lost, often losing, many Jewish lives. We also lost economically billions and billions of dollars. People that were wealthy, who survived, managed to survive, had nothing. Why should they get something back? I mean, they lost all this. So there were two sides to the issue, and it's a very interesting question about it's that was very interesting. I think it raises some very interesting questions about the reparations. But in any event, so in that sense, I'm saying you could say v'nitzaltem. This is I don't think it means this in Russia, but there's a certain way you are redeeming Egypt by allowing people to sort of do the right thing, or to try in some small measure to make it up. You can give them a certain amount of you're giving them an opportunity at least to respond in some positive way. Obviously, it can't make up for the devastation clearly, but anyway, this is the question. It was a big question in the Jewish community, and I grew up with this question, but but the nitzaltem is usually translated to empty out Egypt. The nitzaltem, if it's right. Okay. Anybody else?
Yes.
Yes.
At the risk of talking too much this morning, but if the rechush that Avram came away with led to no good, so knowing this, and gold is a temptation, and especially Egyptian gold is a temptation. So it seems like there was some built-in predestination into the story of Metzias Mitzrayim with the eagle.
Well, I would say this. First of all, I think the question about Avram taking rechush, I don't think it's that simple. I mean, yes, it's certainly the case that in the case of his wife Sarah, he went down to Egypt. He put her in jeopardy. She was grabbed by Paro. He was given a lot of gifts, including gold and silver, by the way. But she resented that very bitterly, as in the story of Hagar. You mistreat me, you belittle me, and all that's true. Now, the Medrash deals with that money, and the Medrash is very interesting. But I wouldn't necessarily say that no good came of that money, because a lot of good came of some of that money, because Avram, after the Akedah, in chapters 23, 24, 25, he uses that money. He pays Ephron 400 shekel kesef, the fortune, to bury Sarah and to purchase a field that he initially didn't even want to buy. Ephron makes it a package deal. If you want the grave at the edge of the field, you buy the field. I'll give it to you for nothing, he says. The field of the grave, knowing that Avram doesn't want it for nothing. He wants to pay. You pay. I'll pay you the full price. Okay, it's a grave in the field. What's the cost? Tell me. Oh, the grave is $4,000. the field is a $74 million. You want it? No problem. 400 shekel kesef. That's the first story. In the second story, he's got to get a wife for Isaac. So he sends his servant down, and what does the Torah say? V'chotuv adonav biyado, and all the wealth of his master was with him. A blank check, basically. And the servant uses that money to convince the family to allow Rivka to marry Yitzchak. That's the second story. In the third story, he marries Keturah, chapter 25, and it says, Abraham, and to the children of the concubines he gave gifts, and he sends them away from Isaac. So he uses that money, he says, kids, family, concubines, here's all my money, take the money, but you got to leave. He's protecting Isaac. And the Medrash says, where's this money coming from? Says the Medrash, Rashi quotes it. It's the money he got from Sarah when Sarah was taken on 2 occasions. That money he uses to properly to bury Sarah, to find a replacement for Sarah, and to protect Isaac. So I wouldn't necessarily say that no good comes of the money, but and also remember, the king of Sodom, he refuses to take money. The king of Sodom offers him money, I'm not taking from you. So there is, I think, an attempt truly the rabbinic attempt to clear that up. But even in the pshat of the Chumash, he uses that money. He's willing to spend any amount of money in order to secure what he feels is important. At the end of the day, that's what money is for. How much money do people need? You know what I mean? People have billions of dollars. Why? What can you do with it? There's only one thing to do with it. You give it to charitable causes. There's no other reason for it, actually.
Yes,
zero.
Rabbi Silber, hi, excuse me, but Rabbi Silber, Hagar was part of the Rechush also. So we can't just color the Rechush as well, it's the reparations for the suffering. I mean, basically, Hagar, who caused the whole upheaval in the house of Abraham and the whole mess subsequently, was also part of the Rechush. So the Rechush was absolutely a double-edged sword.
Of course, it's a double-edged sword. It's certainly very negative in the story. My point is, it's double-edged. It's not clear because on the other hand, he uses the Rechush to secure what he thinks is important, and he gives a blank check for it. Also, it's not about he'll pay whatever it costs him. He's going to pay. That's the point of those stories. It doesn't matter what it is. So of course, Hagar is very problematic. It's not just Hagar's fault. It's Hagar's fault. It's Avram's fault. It's Sarah's fault. It's Yishmael's fault. They're all guilty.
The Rechush, just like with the Egel. I mean, I look at that as a type of metaphorical Egel. I mean, the Egel was made with the Rechush. There were other good things that were done with the Rechush later on, but Hagar was part of the Rechush, caused a huge amount of strife intrafamiliar. Okay, and so it isn't just the money that was used for the grave for Sarah and to cover her eyes. It was hugely double-edged.
Okay, we don't disagree about that. It's certainly the case. Yeah, Hagar is sent away at the end of the day. She can't be, she's sent away and she has to be removed from the family.
I don't know. Rashi says that Keturah Zo Hagar.
Yeah, Rashi says the Medrash is right. So Rashi has the Medrash has some Midrashim have Hagar being taken back, but the pshat of the Medrash is once it's clear that Yitzchak is the heir, you can bring her back. The reason Hagar is problematic is because when she's there, Avram can't see straight. He can't see that it's Yitzchak. But once after the Akedah, take her back. What's the difference? Yitzchak already is the one and only covenantal child. Then you can take it to her. That's what the marriage is getting at. Okay, folks. Yeah. Okay.
I had one more.
Yes.
I had an idea I wanted to share.
Yes. Right.
When you said the idea that Moshe, that Hashem just was saying that they're going into the land, that it was, if I can put it this way, it was rather simplistic. It didn't have a lot of religious content to it. It struck me, it reminded me that the parsha after Yitro is Mishpatim.
Yes.
And the first law that they are given is about Avadim. That what the people can deal with at this point is very basic. And Hashem relates to them, Ba'asher Husham, on the level that they are. He's not going to start with religious things because that's not where they're at. He's not going to start with highfalutin ideas because what they want to know is, what does the religion say? I remember many years ago, I asked my father, why doesn't he start with something really philosophical and beautiful after Har Sinai? You could pick anything. So he said, you're looking at it with your 20th century eyes. And he said to me, they're slaves. What they want to know is, how does this new religion deal with slaves?
Oh, for
That's
sure.
what
That's
speaks to
100%.
them. So
It's
that's
not
the
just
same
that. I mean,
thing what
it's
you're
actually
saying.
right. There are other things in Sefer in Mishpatim, which we'll hopefully get there, which is the case. I would say one thing about what you said, which I would formulate differently, which is saying to the slaves that we're going to take you out of lands of oppression, and it's a place that you can go to, which you'll be free and safe, is not a small thing. The fact of the matter is that after the Shoah, Jews, survivors, where could they go? You know what I mean? There were very few countries that would take them in. The one country that would take them in, actually, besides Israel, was, believe it or not, the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic was taking 100,000 Jews even before the Shoah. The only country, I think, Costa Rica, that was it. All the other countries, with all the talk, took in that very few Jews. The fact of the matter is that Israel, one great significance of Israel was that it was a place where Jews know that if you can manage to get by the British or whatever, you could actually be safe there. You can be protected. And that's not a small thing, that this is the place that can protect Jews. I think about this all the time. You know, how many Jewish history is filled with stories of massacres and murders of Jews, and nobody avenged the Jews. Nobody stood up for the Jews. And now we have an Israeli army, and it didn't take them any time. Jewish blood can't always be so cheap. That's the first thing. That's not a small thing by me. That's my opinion. That now there's something else about Israel, which is the land of Israel, which is the holiness of the land, the connection to God, which in the Chumash is very central. But I don't think we should minimize the idea that this is a safe haven. I mean, this is not a small thing. Taking slaves out of Egypt, where they're being thrown into the river, right? The boys are being murdered. It's not a small thing. And I think, and Moshe is, when we first meet Moshe, we don't know what he knows about the covenant or anything else, but he knows one thing. He knows right from wrong. And he knows you've got to protect the marginalized people so that I think is a very important point. In the Chumash, in chapter 3, with the snare, it's about safe haven. Get to chapter 6, that's another story. There, the land is just a connector between Israel and God. It's not even so much the land. It is land, but land is a connection. We'll get there. Okay.
Rabbi
All right.
Silber, may
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
I just want to clear something that's been bothering me for a really long time.
Yes.
In Pasuk Chafbet, it says V'shala isha mishchenta u'migarat beita, and Sefaria translates that as the neighbor and the lodger. But weren't all of Bnei Yisrael cloistered and segregated in Goshen? So how do they have Egyptian neighbors? And particularly, how do they have lodgers who are Egyptian? I thought
that's a very good question. Right. It's very good. It's a very good question. It's not clear. I mean, it's not clear that every Jew was a slave. It's not clear at all. First of all, maybe the men were slaves and the women were not that many were slaves, right? Because Paro initially says, kill the boys. He didn't say take the women, kill the men. But your point is well taken, that it would appear, look, the different descriptions of the situation in Mitzrayim. Even remember the psukim in Sefer Devarim. You do not hate the Egyptians, right? You were a stranger in their land, which is a remarkable thing to say. So there were good times, there were bad times, there was slavery, but it sounds like everybody wasn't a slave. It's probably the reality of it, but you're very well taken. Migarat Beitah sounds they're living together. Not everybody was a slave. Even in the worst situations, even the Shoah. I mean, there were non-Jews who took Jews in, who protected them in some lands more well, and often at great risk, I would add. So it's never 100% one way or the other. Overall, we remember the slavery in Egypt, but every so often you read psukim that suggest that it wasn't everybody, that there were different kinds of situations, which makes complete sense. It sounds from that reality is that way, I believe.
Also, there's a discrepancy between what is said here, which is that the women will ask the women for gifts, and in Perek Yud Bet it says V'nei Yisrael asu kidvar Moshe v'yishalu. That means everybody. So
right, that is true. Right.
My thought is that I don't know what Egyptian society was like at that time, but I can't imagine that women were on the same level of citizenship as men, and therefore perhaps they had a little bit of fellow feeling for the women of Bnei Israel that wasn't felt on higher echelons of society.
That I would say highly likely that's the case. Even in the worst situations, people have all kinds of relationships and make connections, and life is very complicated. But we'll see over time. What the Chumash is suggesting over here is that over time, the people, I think over the course of the plagues, the Egyptian people will begin to see the Jews differently. Not just, downtrodden you can beat up on, but when these plagues keep happening, then suddenly the Jews are actually looked at differently. So that by the time the ninth plague is over, they can actually bring the sacrifice, the Korban Pesach, inside Egypt. Because Moshe always is requesting to bring the sacrifice, go out to the desert to bring the sacrifice. We can't do it in Egypt, they'll kill us. But after the ninth plague, the Torah says that at that point, they're so popular and they're looked upon so favorably that it's possible to bring that very same sacrifice inside the land of Egypt. But we'll see. We'll hopefully get there. All right, let's pick up now with chapter 4. All right, now we have chapter 4. The questions are very good, by the way. I feel they add a lot, and it's important to keep the questions coming. I very much value that. Okay, but we have another 10 minutes or so, 7-8 minutes. Vayad Moshe Vayomer. This is remarkable. So God has been negotiating this and that. Don't worry, I'll take. Says Moshe, "V'hei lo yaminu li, v'lo yishmu koli, ki yamru derech Hashem." After everything, God said they will believe you. They will believe you. They're going to believe you. They're going to go with you. And Moshe turns to God and says, "They're not going to believe me. They're not going to believe that you even spoke to me." So what did we do with this verse, which would seem to contradict, straight up contradiction, verse number 18 of the previous chapter. They're going to listen to you, right? And they're going to go with you, and you will go with them to Paro. It says Moshe, they're not going to believe me. How's that possible? So there are different answers. The commentaries give different answers. One is that the Ibn Ezra's answer is that God had said, speak to the elders. The elders will believe you. But Moshe's point is, maybe the elders will believe me, but the people won't believe me. That's the way the Ibn Ezra gets out of the problem. Okay. Midrashim, though, fundamentally, many Midrashim see Moshe's doubt here as highly problematic, and God's response as, one might say, a punishment or a kind of warning to Moshe, the way God responds. There are different ways to resolve the problem. I would say that in general, we can raise the question, is Moshe's refusal, there are two ways to see the refusal. You can see it as a kind of modesty. Moshe is an honor. He doesn't see himself as capable of doing this job. Okay, get someone better than me. That's one way to see it. That has a positive side to it. Or you can see it as, a refusal for whatever his reasons to carry out God's will, and that's negative. And there are two different ways to read it, but God's response over here, many Midrashim see God's response as a chastising of Moshe. So let's read this quickly. What's in your hand? Oh, my staff. Throw it to the ground. turns into a snake. Vayonos Moshe mipanav, and Moshe runs away from it in fear. That's the first sign. Vayomer Hashem Moshe, shlach yodcha ve'echos biznavo. Now grab onto its tail. Vayishlach yodo vayachzik bo. It turns back into a mateh. L'mayhem yamidu ki nira alecha Hashem Elohei avotam, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. So here we have the first sign. Moshe's not going to believe me, and God says, "No, I'll give you a sign that they will believe you." Now, the very sign itself, turning your staff into a snake and reversing it back into a staff. And Moshe obviously is very frightened by this. He runs away from the snake. So there's something about the sign, which I think clearly has a negative piece to it. But I think it's interesting to note that we'll get to the second sign, which is also problematic, to put it mildly. But what's interesting is that turning the staff into a snake, a nachash, that you have in chapter 4, these few verses of chapter 4. But later on, when Moshe and Aaron actually go to Paro, and they say to Paro, we just find this pasuk over here. It's later on, not just 1 second. Not right away over here, but later on with the plagues. 1 second. When they go for the plagues, find that verse very quickly. Where is this? Let's find this. Why can't I find this? 1 second. Yes, it's chapter 7. Chapter 7, beginning at verse number 9. So God spoke to Moshe and Aaron. When you go to see Paro, he's going to say, "Show me a miracle." The miracle is to validate the fact that you have of high standing in the Egyptian society. The Egyptians have magicians. You want to speak to Paro? What are your credentials? Show me what you can do. Give me a sign. So God says to them, tell Aaron, say to Aaron, Kachet matcha v'yashlicheu l'fnei Paro yihi tanin. Turn your staff into a tanin. A tanin is a serpent. So Moshe and Aaron go to Paro, and they do that. Vayashlech Aaron and Mateu l'fnei Paro l'fnei avodah v'yihu tanin. His staff turns into a serpent. Vayikra gam Paro v'chachamim v'chashvim. So now Paro calls his own wise men and his magicians. Vayasu gam hey v'chatimei Mitzrayim b'lat ayam. Okay, they do the same thing. Their staffs turn into serpents. Vayashlichu ish Mateu v'yihu taninim. Vayivra Matei Aaron et matotam. But Aaron's serpent swallows up the other serpents. But Paro hardens his heart. I just want to say something about this idea. First of all, it's very interesting that over here in chapter 4, maybe we'll discuss this next week, Moshe's staff turns into a nachash. Here the term is nachash, but later the term is tanin. Now we remember from Breshit, chapter 1, and then chapter 3, that in chapter 1, God creates the great Taninim. And in chapter 2 and 3, there's a story of the Nachash. Nachash and Tanin are synonyms. But what it sounds like to me over here is Moshe's credentials, right? In other words, the credentials that God is giving Moshe over here are credentials as a high-level Egyptian. That's the point. The idea of the Chartumim can turn the mateh into a tanin. Later, Aaron will turn his mateh into a tanin. To stay before Paro, you have to validate themselves as an Egyptian, high-level Egyptian as they might validate themselves. And over here, though, the signs are not to Mitzrayim. The signs are to Bnei Israel, right? These are not signs for Paro. because Moshe says they, the Jews, won't believe me. So the first sign that Moshe is given to the Jews is as Moses, the high-level Egyptian. I want to talk about that more next week because it touches on something very basic in the story, which is who are these people that Moshe supposedly is to redeem? The Jews. To what degree are the Jews in Egypt Jews? And to what degree are the Jews in Egypt Egyptians? And that is, I think, a pretty central question in the Chumash. I think when we read as we read through the Torah, I think one can make a pretty strong case that to some extent, anyway, psychologically, emotionally, or whatever, that the Jews in Mitzrayim are not fully Jews, that they have over time become, to some extent, Egyptians. So this actually makes perfect sense. And you can see God's disappointment to Moshe. God says to Moshe, listen, go down to Mitzrayim. I'm going to be with you. Just go. Rely on me. And for whatever reason, Moshe can't do that. Moshe seems to want to extract one concession from God after the next. And this, I think, is a major concession. So we'll start with this next week, and we'll hopefully finish this negotiation. At the end of the day, Moshe will succeed in extracting from God two main concessions. We'll talk about this next week.
And it's amazing. It's amazing, Vayanas, like immediately, so that they would be divinic immediately. You forget that he ran away. It's already part of that personality. But also it separates from the human doing it, that high level magician, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that's the what you see, he's dealing with, later on, he deals with the culture of Mitzrayim. I mean, it's clear. I mean, this is a very interesting question. It comes up in the Chumash, it comes up in other biblical texts as well, in Yechezkel, etc. In other texts, there's a different view about Jews in Egypt. To some extent, they were pretty assimilated into the culture, into the religion of Mitzrayim. We'll have a chance to talk about that as we go through these chapters. I'll stop at this point and look forward to continuing. If anybody, you can always email me with dsilber@trisha.org.
I just wanted to make one short comment about the blood money. Begin had a tremendous speech about that. That was a tremendous historical thing in Israel. It really almost brought the government down. He spoke very powerfully. You can look that up. Amazing about that. He was very much against it.
Yeah. Now, there was a great debate. It's not a simple matter.
No.
Fact of the matter is, though, I mean, one point is clear, that with the possible exception of the United States, I say possible, the greatest friend Israel has had for many, many years has been Germany. And there's no question about that. They've been the great friends of the Jews. I mean, they want to make, obviously, it's not for us to forgive and forget, but the fact of the matter is, reality is that's been true, that they've been very supportive of Israel, even in situations where the rest of the world has been disappointing. Okay, we will continue next week with this. So, okay, looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. Thank you, Rabbi Silber, and safe travels. It seems as though you're, heading back to New York.
Yeah, should come back, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully that all goes well.
Refuah Shlema.
Refuah Shlema.
Oh, yes. Thank you, I think that's true. Okay, thank you very much.
Looking forward to next week.
Bye-bye.
So, thank you.